And so we return to discuss Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche. I will be reading yet again my translation into English of the text, and I will be lecturing on the text and commenting on the text from time to time. Let's get started. We left off with section 8 of the book. Paragraph 240. Once more, and for the first time, I hear Richard Wagner's overture to Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. It is splendid, over-encumbered, heavy, late-stage art, which pridefully assumes that 2 centuries of music are still living for the purpose of making the work understandable. It is to the German's honor that such a pride made no mistakes. What succulence, what forces, what seasons, what climes are here not intermingled. Sometimes it strikes us as ancient. Sometimes it strikes us as exotic, bitter, and juvenile. Sometimes it is just as arbitrary as it is ponderously conventional. It is not seldom curmudgeonly. More often it is coarse and gross. It is fire and courage, and at the same time the flaccid fallow skin of fruit, which ripens too late. It streams out wide and full, and suddenly there is a moment of inexplicable tentativeness, as if it were a hole that ruptures between cause and effect, as if it were a hole that ruptures between cause and effect, a pressure that gives us to dream, almost a nightmare. But already the old flow of comfort broadens and expands once more. The most multifaceted kind of comfort, the comfort of old and new happiness, certainly including the feeling of happiness that the artist has for himself, a happiness that he refuses to hide. The amazed, happy, shared knowledge of his mastery of the means that are here applied, his new and newly acquired, never tested aesthetic equipment, which he appears to reveal to us. All in all, no beauty, no south, nothing of the southern refined brightness of the sky, nothing graceful, no dancing, scarcely a will to logic. Even a certain vulgarity that is highlighted as if the artist wished to say to us, this was my intention. A portentous garbing, something arbitrarily barbarous and solemn, a flurry of scholarly and reverential preciosity and witticism. Something German in the best and worst senses of the word, something multiple, amorphous, and inexhaustible in the German manner. A certain German potency and overflowing of the soul, which is unafraid to conceal itself beneath the raffinement of decadence, which is where it feels best. A right, genuine, veritable sign of the German soul, which is at the same time young and old, overripe and overrich in the future. This kind of music expresses best what I think of the Germans. They are from the day before yesterday and from the day. No. They are from the day before yesterday and from yesterday. They still have no today. There is a mistake in my translation which I would like to correct. This kind of music expresses best what I think of the Germans. They are from the day before yesterday and from the day after tomorrow. They still have no today. Now, I think it's clear. First of all, this is the most striking and convincing description of a piece of music that I have ever read. And secondly, I just want to make the very simple point, and probably an obvious point, that by criticizing and by analyzing the overture of Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg by Richard Wagner, Nietzsche is really criticizing German culture. So the overture is a metonym for German culture, for contemporary German culture, that is to say, for late 19th century German culture. 241, we good Europeans, in quotation marks, even we have hours when we permit ourselves a heartful fatherlandness. Fatherlandness is how I translate Vaterländerei in the German. Again, we good Europeans, in quotation marks, even we have hours when we permit ourselves a heartful fatherlandness. Vaterländerei. Hours when we slide and plop down into old loves and a bit of narrowness. I gave an example thereof in the passage above. From time to time, even we have surges of nationalism, moments when we are oppressed by bursts of patriotism, when we are inundated by all kinds of ancient feelings, right? Atavistic feelings, right? This doesn't mean that Nietzsche is a nationalist, far from it. It means that he has atavistic moments, right? Weighty spirits, such as we are, might take a long time to have done with such moments, moments that are restricted to a few hours, and then might be over with in a few hours. For one of us, it might take half a year. In another, it might take the course of one's human life. It depends on the speed and the force with which they digest and metabolize, in quotation marks. Indeed, I could think of dull, halting races of people that would need, even in our fast-paced Europe, half a century to overcome their atavistic attacks of fatherlandness, and glued to the soilness, and reclaim their reason, by which I mean their, in quotes, good Europeanness. Glued to the soilness is how I translate the word in German, Scholenkleberei, Scholenkleberei. And as I am digressing on this possibility, it strikes me that I am the ear witness of a conversation between two old patriots. Evidently, they are hard of hearing, and for that reason are speaking all the louder. He has opinions and knowledge of philosophy, as much as a farmer or a fraternity brother, one of them says. He is still innocent, but who cares about any of them today? This is the time of the masses. All prostrate themselves before massiveness. And that's how it is in politics, too. They call a statesman great if he builds up a new Tower of Babel, some behemoth of realm and power, who cares whether we more careful ones and more reserved ones in the meantime don't believe that a great thought leads to a great deed or a great cause? Suppose that a statesman brought his people into a position where they were forced to pursue great politics, a position for which they were badly equipped by nature and for which they were badly prepared, so that it were necessary for them to sacrifice their old and reliable virtues for the sake of a new and dubious mediocrity. Suppose a statesman condemned his people to politicization when they have much better things to do and better things to think about, and in the core of their souls have never freed themselves from a circumspect disgust for restiveness, emptiness, and a noisy vixenishness. That last part was difficult to render into English, so what I translated as noisy vixenishness in the German is die lärmende Zankteufelei. I did the best I could there. Suppose that such a statesman prods the dormant passions and cupidity of his people, makes a flaw of their former coyness and enjoyment of stasis, makes a sin of their exoticism and secret infinitude, devalues their most ardent habits, reverses their conscience, narrows their spirit, nationalizes their taste. How is this? A statesman who would do all of this, who would force his people to do penance for all of the future, if there even were a future. Such a statesman would be great. The other old patriot answered the first with vigor. Of course, otherwise he couldn't have done it. Was it insane to have such desires? But perhaps all greatness is insane at its inception. His interlocutor screams at him, misuse of words, strong, strong, strong and insane, not great. The old men had evidently gotten themselves heated as they screamed their truths in each other's faces in such a fashion. I, however, in my happiness and in my beyond, thought how soon the stronger become master over the strong, and also that the intellectual flattening of a people equals the deepening of the other. The beyond, by the way, is the space in which the free spirit hovers, because the free spirit is above it all. The free spirit floats, the free spirit levitates, the free spirit hovers over all dichotomies, over all oppositions, over all dualisms, all false dichotomies, false oppositions, false dualisms. You see, because the free spirit doesn't choose a side. The free spirit doesn't choose a pro or a contra, a for or an against. The free spirit doesn't belong to any party or any ideology. The free spirit, again, hovers, floats, levitates above all ideologies, including nationalistic ideologies, including patriotic ideologies. So he or she might kind of dunk into these ideologies, kind of he or she might indulge him or herself in these ideologies from time to time, as Nietzsche says he does. You know, maybe 1 hour a year, he might be a patriot. But that's just a mask that he wears. And then he takes the mask off. He puts the mask on again once a year, and then he takes the mask off again. Such is the life of the free spirit, the Freigeist. The distinction that Europeans are seeking, whether one calls it civilization or humanization or progress, let it be called simply, without praise or blame, the democratic movement in Europe, to use a political formula. beneath the foreground of morality and politics that is indicated by such formulae, an extraordinary physiological process is occurring, a process that is constantly flowing. It is the process of approximating all Europeans. It is their growing liberation from the conditions under which races of people originate, races that are climate-bound and class-bound. It is their progressive independence from that determinate milieu which has inscribed its demands within their souls and bodies for centuries. It is thus the slow emergence of an essentially supranational and nomadic kind of person who, physiologically speaking, possesses the maximum skill and power of adaptation. It is exemplified by this distinction. The process of the European who is becoming, who might be slowed down by lapses in tempo, who can perhaps gain vehemence and depth thereby, who can grow. The storm and stress of the current period of nationalistic feeling belongs here, as does the emergent movement of anarchism. This process will probably produce results that might not be expected by its naive promoters and eulogists, the apostles of modern ideas, the same new conditions that give rise to the equalization and banalization of humanity. The same new conditions that form a serviceable, sedulous, multiply useful, and employable herd animal human are to the highest degree suitable to generate the most dangerous and most prepossessing qualities of the exceptional human, while that adaptive power, which experiments with ever-changing conditions and works anew on every new generation, with almost every new decade, making the powerfulness of that type impossible. While the total impression of such a future European will probably be a garrulous, weak-willed, and extremely employable worker who needs a master as he needs his daily bread, while therefore the democratization of Europe proceeds from the engendering of slavery in the most subtle sense of the word. In individual and in exceptional cases, the strong human will be forced to become stronger and richer than he or she has ever been before, thanks to the absence of prejudice in his or her schooling, thanks to the monstrous plurality of exercises, arts, and masks. I would like to say that the democratization of Europe is at the same time the involuntary institution of a breeding ground for tyrants. I intend the word tyrants in every sense, including in the intellectual. I am pleased to hear that our sun is rushing toward the Hercules constellation, and I hope that the human beings upon this earth will do as the sun does, and we at the vanguard, we good Europeans. 244. There was a time when one was accustomed to naming the Germans with the distinguished word profound. Now that the new, more successful type of German is greedy for much different honors, and now that the sharpness, in quotes, is perhaps missing from his depth, it is almost certainly timely and patriotic to ask if one did not deceive oneself in giving such praise. We might ask whether the German depth is not fundamentally something much different and worse than what it appears to be. Perhaps it is something that one can successfully get rid of, thank God. Let us then attempt to relearn German profundity. Nothing is more necessary for this purpose than a little vivisection of the German soul. The German soul is above all composed of multiple and diverse origins. It is more assembled and agglomerated than actually built. That is because of its provenance. Any German who would be emboldened to claim, "Two souls dwell, alas, in my breast." That's a quote from Faust, Goethe's Faust. Would be misapprehending the truth. It would be more accurate to claim that he missed the truth, that there are many souls within, The Germans are a group of people who are the most extraordinary mingling and confluence of races, perhaps even with a surplus of pre-Aryan elements, a people of the center in every sense, not just geographically in the center, but There are people of the center. There is a synthesis of many other populations. The Germans are more incomprehensible, more comprehensive, more contradictory, more obscure, more unpredictable, more surprising, even more terrifying to themselves than any other group of people. They evade definition and are, for that reason, the despair of the French. The fact that the question, what is German, never dies out is characteristic of the Germans. Kotzebue knew the Germans well enough. We are recognized, they rejoiced to him, and even Sand believed that she knew them. Jean-Paul knew what he was doing when he railed against Fichte's mendacious, yet patriotic flatteries and hyperbole. However, it is likely that Goethe thought otherwise about the Germans than Jean-Paul did, even though Goethe did concur with his critique of Fichte. What did Goethe actually think about the Germans? But there are so many things that he never explicitly spoke of, so many things about which he knew to be silent. It was a lifelong, prudent silence. He probably had good reasons for it. It was certainly not the wars of independence that made him gaze joyfully upward, any more than it was the French Revolution. The event that prompted him to rethink his Faust, indeed the event that prompted him to rethink the entire problem of the human, was the appearance of Napoleon. There are words of Goethe in which he repudiates German as if he were an outsider, repudiating with an impatient severity everything that the Germans consider their pride. Goethe once defined the famous German mind as forbearance of the weaknesses of others, forbearance of one's own weaknesses. Was he incorrect? One of the traits of the Germans is that one is hardly ever completely wrong about them. The German soul bears within itself passageways and breezeways. There are caverns within it and hiding places, castle dungeons. The chaos of the German soul has the charm of an enigma. The German understands the secret passages to chaos. And as everything loves its likeness, so does the German love the clouds and all that is unclear, all that becomes, all that is twilight, all that is moist and ominously impending. He feels that anything which is uncertain, shapeless, self-displacing, and intensifying is deep. The German is nothing in himself. He becomes, he develops himself. Development is therefore the genuinely German catch and release game in the grand realm of philosophical formulae. Development is a regent concept, allied with German beer and German music, that is laboring to Germanize the whole of Europe. Foreigners stand astounded and fascinated before the enigmas produced by the antinomic nature of the German soul, which Hegel used in his system and which Richard Wagner ultimately put into music. Good-natured yet mean-spirited, such a complementarity would be impossible for any other population. Unfortunately, it is justified all too often in Germany. Just live for a while among the Swabians. The awkwardness of the German scholar, his social gaucheness, corresponds terrifyingly well with a kind of inner tightrope walking and easy audacity that all the gods have learned to fear. If anyone wishes to demonstrate the German soul ad oculos, just look at the German taste, German arts and culture. What a plebeian indifference toward matters of taste. How the noblest and the commonest stand beside one another. How disorderly and overflowing is the entire economy of the soul. The German drags his soul around. He drags around everything that he has experienced. He badly digests his experiences. He will never be finished with them. His German depth is often nothing more than a heavy, halting form of digestion. And as with all the sick, as with all dyspeptics who have the urge for comfort, so the German loves openness and conventionality. How comfortable it is to be open and conventional. Today's German understands that being confiding and accommodating and leaving one's cards on their table, German honesty, is perhaps the most dangerous and fortunate kind of concealment. It is his genuinely Mephistophelian art with which he can nonetheless go too far. The German lets himself go and looks out with true, blue, empty German eyes. And foreigners quickly mistake him with a nightshirt. I would like to say, let the German profundity be what it will. Between us, we shall not permit ourselves to have a laugh about it. Between us, shall we not permit ourselves to have a laugh about it? We would do well henceforth to honor the appearance and good name of German profundity, and not to take it out in trade, not to exchange it too easily for Prussian sharpness and Berlinian wit and sand. It is clever for a people to take themselves for deep, for incompetent, for good nature, and for honest, for dim-witted, or to allow themselves to be so taken. That could even be a kind of depth. Lastly, one should honor one's name. The Germans, die Deutschen, are not called the Täusche people for nothing. The deceptive people, das Täusche Volk, the deceptive people, the people of deception. 245, the good old days are over, Mozart sang them out. How fortunate we are that his Rococo still speaks to us. How fortunate we are that his good society, his tender exaltations, his childish pleasure in Chinese culture and in arabesques, his heartfelt etiquette, his yearning for the delicate, for the darling, for the dancing, and for the lachrymose, his faith in Southern Europe still appeal to something residual within us. Alas, someday this will all be gone. But who would doubt that the understanding and taste for Beethoven will be gone even sooner, though he was only the swan song of a stylistic transition and a stylistic interruption, and not, as was Mozart, the swan song of a grand European taste that lasted for centuries. Here, Nietzsche seems to be saying that Mozart is the culmination of classicism, whereas Beethoven is a transitional stage between classicism and romanticism. At least that's how I read this passage. I'm not a musicologist or a music historian, but that seems to be what he's saying. Beethoven is the intermediate stage between an old, brittle soul that is constantly shattering and a futurely immature soul that is constantly approaching. Upon his music settles that twilight of eternal loss and eternally illimitable hope, the same light that suffused Europe when it dreamed along with Rousseau, when it danced around the tree of freedom of the Revolution, and ended by virtually idolizing Napoleon. But how quickly does this feeling blanch? How difficult it is to even know this feeling today. How strange does the language of this Rousseau, Schiller, Shelley, and Byron sound to our ears. And this is in 1886, in 1885, 1886. Nietzsche was experiencing the dawn of modernity at this point. There's more to say, but let me just go on. A collective language in which the destiny of Europe was verbalized. The language that Beethoven knew how to make sing. The next stage of a German music was Romanticism. That is to say, historically considered a briefer, more volatile, more superficial movement than that great interlude, that transition from Rousseau to Napoleon and to the resurrection of democracy. Weber? What are his Freischütz and Oberon to us today? Or Marschner's Hans Heiling or Vampire? or even Wagner's Tannhäuser. That sound has now faded, even though the music has not yet been completely forgotten. The whole of Romantic music was scarcely elegant enough, scarcely music enough, to have any right to be anywhere other than in the theater in front of a crowd. From the beginning, it was second-rate music. Music that only a few real musicians took seriously. Things stood otherwise with Felix Mendelssohn, that halcyon master who, thanks to his lighter, purer, more gifted soul, was quickly admired and just as quickly forgotten as a beautiful incident within German music. As far as Robert Schumann is concerned, he was taken seriously and took things seriously himself right from the beginning. He was the last one to found a school. But between you and me, is it not fortunate? Is it not a relief? Is it not liberating to know that Schumannian Romanticism has been overthrown? Yeah. Schumann, who flushed into the Saxon Switzerland of his soul. Schumann, whose nature was semi-Wertherian and semi-Jean Paulian. Schumann was certainly not Beethovenian and certainly not Byronian. Schumann's Manfred is misbegotten and misconceived to a fault. Schumann's taste was fundamentally a minor taste, namely a dangerous tendency towards serene lyricism and a dipsomania of feeling. This tendency is doubly dangerous among Germans. Schumann is constantly walking on the side of the road. He is always shyly apologizing and retreating. He is a noble tenderling who reveled in nothing but an anonymous joy and an anonymous pain. From his inception, he was a kind of little girl, noli me tangere, do not touch me. This Schumann was nothing more than a German event in music, and not even a European event such as Beethoven was. Nor was he a European event in the even more comprehensive manner than Mozart was. With Schumann, German music met its greatest danger, the loss of the voice of the European soul, sunk into mere fatherlandness. 246. What torture are German language books for those who possess the third ear? How the reader stands unwillingly beside this slowly swirling sump of soundless sounds and undanceable rhythms which the Germans call a book, and the German reader of books, how lazy, how reluctantly, how badly he reads. How many Germans actually know the art that should be placed into every sentence, and how many Germans demand the knowledge thereof? It is an art that wants to be fathomed as much as the sentence wants to be understood. A misunderstanding about its tempo, for example, and the sentence itself has to be misunderstood. And the sentence itself has been misunderstood. To be confident with rhythmically decisive syllables, to find charming and deliberate the interruption in all too stringent symmetries, to extend a refined and patient ear to every staccato and rubato, and to fathom the sense in the sequence of vocals and diphthongs, how tenderly and how richly their colors change when placed in succession. Which book-reading German is good-natured enough to recognize such duties and requirements, and to be able to listen to so much art and intention in the language? Ultimately, the Germans do not have the ear for it. And so the strongest stylistic contrasts will not be heard, and the most refined artistry will be squandered, as if upon the dead, as if on the dead. These were my reflections as I observed how someone mistook two masters of the art of prose for each other in such a crass and clueless manner. One of these masters lets the words drip down hesitantly and coldly, as if from the ceiling of a moist cave he expects the dull sound and resonance, and the other grasps his language as if it were a supple dagger, and from finger to toe feels the dangerous joy of the quivering, super sharp cling-clang, which wants to bite, which wants to sizzle, which wants to cut. In the German und einen anderen, der seine Sprache wie einen biegsamen Degen handhabt und vom Arme bis zu sehr hinab das gefährliche Glück der Sittenden, überscharfen Klinge fühlt, welche beißen, zischen, schneiden will. 247. Our best musicians write badly, and this fact shows how little sound and ear there is within the German prose style. Germans do not read aloud. They read with the eye, not with the ear, all the while keeping their ears in a drawer somewhere. When the ancients read, if they read at all, it happened seldom enough, they read aloud to themselves and loudly. Whenever someone read quietly, they were nonplussed and asked themselves why, in private, loudly. That means with all of the swellings, inflections, sudden changes in tone, and alterations in tempo that the ancient public world took pleasure in. Back then, the laws of graphic style were the same as the laws of phonetic style, and those laws partly depended on the astonishing training of the ear and the larynx. The sophisticated precepts for the ear and the larynx, they were also dependent on the strength, duration, and the power of the ancients' lungs. A period is, in the antiquarian sense, a physiological totality unified in a single breath. Such periods as appear in the work of Demosthenes and Cicero swell and sink twice over in a single draught of breath. This is pleasure for the ancients, who knew from their own schooling how to value the virtues of rarity and difficulty in the performance of such periods. We moderns really have no right to the great period. We who are short of breath in every sense, the ancients were altogether dilettantes when it came to speaking. Therefore they were knowers and therefore critics. For this reason, they drove to their rhetorics to the extreme. In the same way, in the previous century, the 18th century, all of the Italians and Italienesses knew how to sing. Through them, lyrical virtuosity, and therefore also the art of melody, reaches its height. Until most recently in Germany, there was a kind of public and vaguely artistic speech, before a kind of grandstand eloquence, shyly and crassly enough, animated its young wings. Before a kind of grandstand eloquence, shyly and crassly enough, animated its young wings. That was the rhetoric which came from the pulpit. The preachers were the ones in Germany. The preachers were the only ones in Germany who knew how much a syllable weighed, how much a word weighed, the extent to which a sentence strikes, leaps, crashes, runs out. They had conscience in their ears, and often enough it was a bad conscience, for there was no shortage of reasons why a German should so rarely attain skillfulness in rhetoric, almost always do so later in life. Always do so later in life. The masterpiece of German prose is, without question, also the masterpiece of the greatest preacher in Germany. The Bible has been the best German book thus far. In comparison with Luther's Bible, almost everything else is just literature, in quotation marks, something that did not germinate in Germany, and therefore did not and does not germinate in German hearts, as the Bible has done. 248. There are two kinds of genius. The first kind of genius procreates and wants to procreate. The second is pleased to be fructified and to give birth. There is the female problem of pregnancy among the second people of genius, to whom has fallen the secret obligation of forming, ripening, completing. The Greeks, for example, were a people of this stripe, as are the French. The first type of genius has the necessity of fructifying and becoming the origin of new orders of life, like the Jews, the Romans, and to ask in all modesty, perhaps the Germans. These people are tortured and raptured by obscure fevers and are ineluctably forced out of themselves, loving and lusting after foreign races, those who let themselves be fructified. They are thereby impelled to mastery, as are all those who are full of procreative forces. Procreative forces, and thus know they are of God's grace. These two forms of genius seek themselves out, as men and women seek themselves out. However, they misunderstood each other. as men and women do. 249. Every population has its own form of Tartuffery and calls this its virtues. No one knows the best of what one is. No one can know the best of what one is. 250. What does Europe owe to the Jews? A great deal, both good and bad, but primarily one thing that is both the best and the worst, the grand style of morality. Europe has the Jews to thank for the fearsomeness and majesty of endless requirements, endless meanings, the whole romanticism and sublimity of moral problematics. But Europe also has the Jews to thank for life's most attractive, most subtle, and most special elements within that play of colors and seductiveness, in whose after shimmer the evening sky of contemporary European culture is glowing, and perhaps is glowing out. Along with the spectators and philosophers, those of us who are artists are thus grateful to the Jews. You see, Nietzsche was a lover of the Jewish people. He was a philo-Judaist, a lover of Judaism and a lover of the Jewish people. It's clear. And if you don't believe me, in the next paragraph, Nietzsche will praise the Jews to the sky. He held the Jews not just in high esteem, he held the Jewish people in the highest esteem. He loved the Jewish people. 251. One has to accept the fact that a people will want to suffer from nationalistic typhus and political ambitiousness. All kinds of clouds, all kinds of disturbances will waft over their spirit, basically minor attacks of stupefaction. With today's Germans, for example, there is the anti-French stupidity, the anti-Judaic stupidity, the anti-Polish stupidity, the Christian romantic stupidity, and the Wagnerian stupidity, the Teutonic stupidity, the Prussian stupidity, and whatever they are called. Look at the miserable, blubber-headed, bandage-headed historians Subel and Treitschke for examples of these stupidities. Minor becloudings of the German spirit and conscience. Pardon me for not being completely immune from such illnesses when I dwelled for a brief time in a severely infected region. As did everyone else, I had thoughts about the things that did not concern me. The first sign of the political infection, for instance, the Jews. Listen, I have never met a German who was kindly disposed toward the Jews. And even though real anti-Semitism is unconditionally rejected by the prudently and politically minded, this prudence, this political cast of mind is not directed against the feeling of anti-Semitism itself. Rather, it is directed against its dangerous excessiveness. In particular, it is directed against the tasteless and injurious manner in which this immoderate feeling is expressed. Let there be no doubt of this. The statement that Germany has more than enough Jews, that it is necessary for the German stomach, for the German blood, to have done with this quantum of Jews in quotes, and that it has been long since necessary, in the way that the Italians, the French, and the English have done, thanks to their stronger digestive systems. This statement is the clear announcement with an E, the clear language of a universal instinct that one should listen to, that one should act upon. In quotes, do not let any more Jews inside. Close the doors to the Jews, especially the doors to East Germany, also to Austria. This is a quote. This is not Nietzsche. This is a quote. Nietzsche hates this kind of anti-Judaic nationalism. Thus commands the instinct of a people that are so weak and indeterminate that they could easily be wiped out, extinguished by a stronger race. The Jews are doubtless the most vigorous, toughest, and purest race that lives in Europe today. Wow, Nietzsche doesn't sound like a fascist here. Not at all. Nietzsche is an anti-fascist. And again, he is pro-Jewish. They understand how to persevere even in the worst conditions. The Jews understand how to persevere even in the worst conditions, he's saying. Better even than in favorable conditions. better even than in favorable conditions, thanks to virtues that people today would rather label as vices. Thanks above all to a resolute faith that doesn't need to be ashamed before modern ideas. If they change in the way that the Russian regime makes conquests, in the way that regime, which has time on its side, does, in the way that a regime does that wasn't born yesterday. That is, they change according to the foundational principle as slowly as possible. A thinker who has the future of Europe on his conscience will, in every sketch he makes of this future, take the Jews into account in the same way that he would take the Russians into account, as the most certain and likely factor in the great play and struggle of forces. What is called a nation in today's Europe, and what is really more of a res facta than a res nata, and sometimes a res picta, will look exactly the same. What is today called a nation in today's Europe is in each case something that is becoming, something that is young and easily displaceable and not yet a race at all, to say nothing of the ere perennius, which is the Jewish mode. These nations should not be careful and look out for every hot-headed rivalry, for every hot-headed adversarial attitude. The Jews could already have dominance, literal supremacy over Europe by now, if they wanted to, or if they were forced to, which is what the anti-Semites seem to want. This is established, yet they have not worked toward this goal. Likewise, they have not made plans to do so. In the meantime, what they want and wish for instead, indeed with a certain impetuosity, obtrusiveness, pushiness, is to be assimilated with and absorbed by Europe. They are thirsting for this goal, to find a place where they can be fixed, permitted to exist, respected, and to put an end to the nomadic life, the life of the, in quotes, eternal Jew. And one should notice this drive, this push, which expresses, perhaps, even an alleviation of the Jewish instinct, and accommodate them, accommodate the Jews, include the Jews, let the Jews assimilate. For this purpose, it would be perhaps useful and judicious to throw the anti-Semitic loudmouths out of the country. I'm going to read that again, because anyone who doesn't know this yet should know that Nietzsche was not a proto-fascist. He was not a nationalist. He was no proto-Nazi. He was pro-Jewish and pro-Enlightenment, pro-Aufklärung. I want to read this once more, because notice how he is anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic. I love this sentence. Let me read it again, loud and proud. Loudly and proudly. For this purpose, it would be perhaps useful and judicious to throw the anti-Semitic loudmouths out of the country. In other words, throw them out of Germany, throw the anti-Semites out of Germany, and let as many Jews come in as want to come in. I love him. I love him for saying that. Approached cautiously, selectively, around the way that the Jewish nobility does it, it would certainly be unproblematic for the strongest and already well-formed new German types, for instance, the noble officers of the Mark Brandenburg, to engage with them. It would be interesting from a number of perspectives to see, or not to see, whether the genius for fortune and patience, as well as spirit and spiritualness, which is markedly lacking today in the mark, might not be added to, bred into the inherited art of commanding and obedience. Both are classical attributes of the mark. But now it might be opportune for me to end my cheerful Germanomania and my festive speech, for I am already touching on something that I do not take seriously, the so-called, in quotes, European problem, as I understand it, and the breeding for a new caste that would reign over Europe. And no, he's not talking about the Third Reich. He's talking about a new enlightenment, a neo-enlightenment, an egalitarian enlightenment, a philosophocracy, as I've said before, a cognocracy, a rule by the intelligent, a rule of the thinkers, a rule of the free spirits, the rule of freedom, the rule of liberty. Now, you might be bemused by all of this. You might say to yourself or say to the screen, wait a minute, I thought Nietzsche was anti-democracy. I thought that Nietzsche was anti-egalitarian. I thought he was anti-democratic. No. What was called democracy in Nietzsche's time was not democratic enough for Nietzsche. What was called a democracy in Nietzsche's time in the late 19th century was really an ochlocracy. An ochlocracy is rule by the mob. The mob governs society. And that Nietzsche hated, because Nietzsche saw a kind of flattening out, of all distinctions, and the destruction of uniqueness, and the sowing of the seedbed with poison. And from that seedbed, no free spirit could germinate. What he was saying, again, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. The conditions of the modern world were toxic, were venomous, were poisonous for the breeding of great human beings. So a great humanity could not sprout, could not blossom from such a poisonous soil. Nietzsche bemoaned the flattening out of differences. And here he's not talking about segregation or the separation of communities, the separation between or among populations. No. What Nietzsche was worried about was the destruction of the individual. Nietzsche was a radical individualist, and he believed in a community in which the only thing that I have in common with you is that I have nothing in common with you. So Nietzsche believed in a disjunctive community, a community that was not based on the idea of homogeneity, but that was based on the idea of a radical heterogeneity. In other words, a community of differences, a community of self-isolation, an atomistic community, an individualistic community, which I know is a paradox. It's a paradox. (252). This is no philosophical race. The English. Bacon signified an attack on the philosophical mind in general. Hobbes, Hume, and Locke degraded and minimized the value of the concept of the philosopher for over a century. Kant rose up and stood up against Hume. Schelling had this to say about Locke.
Je méprise Locke.
Merci, Simone. Merci bien. I despise Locke. In their fight against the English mechanistic idiotization of the world, Hegel and Schopenhauer, with Goethe, were of one mind. Both fraternal enemy geniuses in philosophy, who moved along the opposite poles of the German spirit, and who thereby did each other wrong, as only brothers can do. Every semi-actor and rhetorician knew well enough what is missing in England, and what has always been missing in England. The gauche, chowderhead Carlyle, who sought to hide beneath grotesquely caricatured emotions what he knew about himself, the real power of intellectuality, the real depth of the intellectual gaze, was missing in himself, basically philosophy. It is characteristic of an unphilosophical race that it holds on to Christendom so tightly. Such a race needs discipline in moralizing and humanization. The English is somber and more sensuous, more strong-willed and more brutal than the German. Between the two of them, the English is the more common one, as well as the more pious one, precisely for those reasons. The English has an even greater need for Christendom. To more sophisticated nostrils, The English Christendom still has the genuinely English, second-hand aroma of spleen and alcoholic excess against which it is rightly used as a remedy. The subtler poison against the cruder poison, then. A subtle poison, in fact, is an advance, is a step toward intellectualization among crude populations. The English vulgarity and peasant seriousness are most tolerably disguised, rather analyzed and reinterpreted through Christian dactylology and through praying and psalmody. Through Christian dactylology and through praying and psalmody. As for that herd of drunk and dissolute cattle which used to grunt their moralisms under the auspices of Methodism, and which today grunt their moralisms as a Salvation Army. For such a herd of cattle, a spasm of contrition might be the highest human accomplishment which they can attain, relatively speaking. This much may be reasonably admitted. This much may be reasonably admitted. The most offensive thing about even the most humane Englishman is his absence of music. To speak metaphorically and literally, he has neither tact nor dance in the movements of his soul and body. Indeed, he doesn't even have the desire for tact or for dance, for music. Listen to him speak. Watch the loveliest English woman as she walks. In no other country on earth are there lovelier doves and swans. Finally, listen to them sing. But I am asking for too much. 253. There are some truths that are understood by mediocre brains better than by any others, because these are the brains that are the most appropriate for them. There are some truths that are only capable of stimulating and enticing mediocre minds. This uncomfortable, unpleasant proposition is being thrust upon us now that the spirit of well-respected yet mediocre Englishmen is preponderating in the middle regions of European taste. I would name Darwin, John Stuart Mill, and Herbert Spencer in this respect. Who would doubt that it is useful for such minds to dominate? For the time being, it would be a mistake to think that those spirits of the higher kind, those spirits which fly beyond, would ever be skilled at establishing and collecting common little facts and deriving conclusions from them. Rather, being the exception, they are not in any favorable position to judge the rule. Ultimately, they have more to do than merely to know. That is, they have to be something new and mean something new. They have to present new values. The chasm between knowledge and ability is perhaps greater and spookier than one thinks. Those who are capable of doing things in the grand style, the creators, might have to be ignorant, while on the other hand, when it comes to scientific discoveries of the Darwinian type, it might not harm to have at one's disposal a certain narrowness, aridity, and diligent carefulness. In short, it might not do any harm to possess English traits. Let us not forget that the English once caused the total depression of the European spirit with their profound banality. With what people term modern ideas, or the ideas of the 18th century, or French ideas. There is no doubt that what the German spirit stood up against with the deepest nausea was of English origin. The French have been nothing more than the apes and the performers of these ideas. Indeed, they have been their best soldiers. Likewise and regrettably, the French were the first, and likewise and regrettably, the French were their first and most fundamental victims. For ultimately, the âme française, the French soul, grew so thin and starved on the damned Anglomania of modern ideas, in quotes, that we look back on their 16th and 17th centuries with their profoundly passionate energy, their inventive elegance, with something akin to disbelief. It is necessary to clamp on this statement of historical fairness with one's teeth, and to defend it against momentary glimpses and illusions. The European noblesse is the invention and work of the French. The feeling, the taste, the customs, in brief, taking the word noblesse in the highest sense. European commonness, the plebeianism of modern ideas, is the invention and the work of the English. 254. Even now, France is still the site of the most spiritual and refined culture in Europe, and the lofty academy of taste. But one must know how to find this France of taste. Whoever belongs to it knows how to hide. There might be a small number of people in which it lives, in which it is bodied forth. To this school belong, perhaps, those who don't. To this school belong, perhaps, those who do not stand on the strongest legs. A portion thereof are fatalists, the somber, the sick. Another parcel comprises the mollycoddled and the artificial, those who are ambitious enough to conceal themselves. They all have something in common. They close their ears to the raging stupidity and loud gabbling of the democratic bourgeois. Indeed, a stupidified and vulgarized France undulates in the foreground today. Recently, France celebrated a real orgy of distastefulness and self-admiration at Victor Hugo's funeral. And they have something else in common: the goodwill to keep intellectual Germanization at bay, and an even greater inability to do so. Perhaps Schopenhauer is now more at home within this France of the spirit, which is also a France of pessimism, than he ever was in Germany, and more comfortably at home within, not to speak of Heinrich Heine, who has transmigrated into the flesh and the blood of some of the more sophisticated and fastidious lyricists of Paris for some time now, or of Hegel, who appears today in the shape of Taine, the preeminent living historian, on whom Hegel exerts a nearly tyrannical influence. As far as Richard Wagner is concerned, the more that French music learns to develop something according to real demands of the M moderne, the modern soul, the more will it Wagnerize. Such may one say in advance. It is already happening. Nevertheless, there are three things that the French may display with pride as their inheritance and as their property, and as unlost traits of an ancient cultural preponderance over Europe, despite all of the voluntary or involuntary Germanization and mobbification of taste. One is the capacity for artistic passion, for the obeisance to form, for which the phrase la polar was invented, besides thousands of others. Something like this has existed in France for 3 centuries, thanks to the French reverence for small numbers, in quotes. A kind of chamber music of literature has been made possible that is missing in the rest of Europe. The second thing that grounds the preponderance of the French over Europe is their ancient, multifaceted, moralistic culture, which means that one finds, generally considered, even among the little romanciers of the newspapers and the occasional boulevardiers of Paris, a certain psychological sensitivity and curiosity that no one finds a concept of in, for example, Germany, to say nothing of the actual thing. For this purpose, the Germans lack a few centuries of moralism, which, as I said above, France has not denied itself. Anyone who calls the Germans naive for this reason is turning a deficiency into something worthy of praise. In contrast to the German inexperience and innocence, involuptate psychologica, which is not remotely related to the tedium of German social intercourse. In this realm of tender shuddering, Henri Beyle counts as the most accomplished expression of a genuinely French curiosity and talent for invention. That remarkably anticipatory forerunner ran with a Napoleonic tempo through his Europe, through many centuries of the European soul. As a detector and discoverer of this soul, 2 centuries were required to somehow catch up with him, to guess some of the riddles that tormented and enraptured him. This wonderful Epicurean and question mark man who was France's last great psychologist. Yet, there is yet a third claim to superiority. The essence of the French is a half-complete synthesis of the North and the South. A synthesis that allows them to comprehend many things and to do many other things that an English would never comprehend. Their temperament is periodically directed toward and diverted away from the South. Within this temperament, from time to time, the Provençal and Ligurian blood froths over. The French shield themselves from the dreadful northern gray on gray and its sunless conceptual spookiness and anemia against the excessiveness of our German disease of taste. One will prescribe blood and iron with great resolve, the great politics, in quotes, according to a dangerous healing art, which teaches me to wait and wait, but not to hope. And in the French, there is a predisposition and an accommodating manner toward those rarer and rarely satisfied people who are too cosmopolitan to find any satisfaction in any kind of fatherlandishness. Toward those who know how to love the North and the South and the North. For the congenital Mediterranean, the good European, in quotation marks. And here we go. This is Nietzsche's favorite musician, Nietzsche's favorite composer. Boese made music for them. Boese, this last genius who has seen a new beauty and seduction and who has discovered a piece of the southernness of music. And here Nietzsche will attack German music some more. 255. With regard to German music, I advise a great deal of caution. Isn't it great when a thinker negates himself or herself? There's a kind of self-deprecation here that's very charming and very healthy and very disarming. It's a bit like when Deleuze writes about the superiority of Anglo-American literature. Now, I like Harold Bloom very much, and rest in peace, Harold Bloom. He recently died. I like him very much. I've read him for many years, and I love his book on Shakespeare. I also like his book, The Visionary Company, but Harold Bloom would say things in public like, English poetry is the greatest poetry in the world. Now, I'm not going to say whether or not that's true. I might agree with that. I might not. I'm not going to say. But I would not say that in public, just as I'm not saying it in public now. So there's something to be said for a thinker who negates himself or herself, that goes against one's heritage, right? I mean, it would be as if, not doing so would be as if I were to have studied Italian literature because I'm Italian. I'm Italian American. But I chose not to do that. I chose to study English literature and German literature and German thought and French thought and French literature. So not that there's anything noble about me doing that, but I wanted to contradict myself. And I think Nietzsche deserves a great deal of credit and approbation for going against himself, for going against his own origin, his own heritage. Don't you think? Provided that one loves the South as much as I love the South, intellectually and sensuously, as a great academy of the healing arts, with its boundless sunniness and sunny transfigurations, which spread over a self-dominating and self-trusting existence. Now, such a person who loves the South in such a manner will learn to be careful about German music, for this kind of music not only will ruin his taste or her taste, it will ruin his health or her health as well. Such a Southerner, not by descent but by faith, must dream of the redemption of music from the North if he or she dreams of the music of the future of music. The genitive is subjective and objective. You could read that as the music of the future or the future of music, subjective or objective, genitive. He or she will dream of having within his ears or her ears the prelude to a more profound, more powerful, and perhaps more evil and more mysterious music, a supra-German music, which does not fade away, grow pale, or become jaundiced before the sight of the voluptuous blue sea, and the Mediterranean sky, as all German music does, a supra-European music that asserts its rights even before the brown sunsets of the desert, its soul related to the palm tree, its soul knowing how to be at home among massive, beautiful, solitary predators, its soul knowing how to wander. I could imagine a music, the rarest magic of which would be that it knew nothing of good and evil. Perhaps it would only know some kind of sailor's homesickness, trembling here and there with a few golden shadows and tender vulnerabilities. It would be an art that would see the escaping colors of a declining, almost incomprehensible moral world from a place far away. And it would be an art that would be hospitable and deep enough to accommodate those who seek asylum later in life. Beautiful, beautiful. Beautiful. 256. Thanks to the diseased estrangement of the populations of Europe from one another, an estrangement that has been set in motion by the lunacy of nationalism and all that is still dividing the populations of Europe. Thanks also to those politicians with their quick glances and precipitous hands who are on top today because of this nationalistic lunacy. You see, Nietzsche is an anti-nationalist and an anti-fascist. These politicians are unaware that the politicians of radical divergence which they pursue is necessarily only an intermediate form of politics. Thanks to all of this, and thanks to much that is unspeakable today, the most unambiguous signs which express that Europe wants to become unified have been either overlooked or mendaciously reinterpreted. The real direction of all the more profound and more expansive human beings of this century has been to prepare, in the mysterious labor of their soul, the way for a new synthesis, and to try to anticipate the European of the future. And I have to wonder, parenthetically, if Nietzsche lived to be 300 years old, maybe not that old, but would Nietzsche have supported the European Union? Let's say 200 years old. Would Nietzsche have supported the idea of the European Union? Would he have been a Eurocrat? Maybe in its inception, but I don't know. Nietzsche was pro-Europe. He was Eurocentric, I suppose. But he was anti-nationalistic. Only in the foreground, only in their weaker hours, such as old age, do they belong to a fatherland. And you know what? No, I want to take that back. He wasn't even Eurocentric. Clearly not. He wasn't even Eurocentric. But he did want to overcome nationalistic divisions. He definitely wanted to do that. And he wanted to have done with internecine nationalistic, internecine international conflicts. Internecine international conflicts. Only in the foreground, only in their weaker hours, such as old age, did they belong to a fatherland. Only when they relaxed from themselves did they become patriots. I'm thinking of Napoleon, Goethe, Beethoven, Stendhal, Heinrich Heine, Schopenhauer. Don't blame me if I include Richard Wagner among them, about whom one should not be led astray by one's own misunderstanding. Geniuses of this type seldom have the right to understand themselves. Even less are they understood, of course, because of the rude noise that the French use to block and shield themselves from Richard Wagner. The fact remains, though, that the French late Romanticism of the 1840s and Richard Wagner belong to each other in the closest and most intimate manner. They are related in all of the heights and the depths of their requirements. They are fundamentally connected. The soul of Europe, the soul of the one Europe, is that which yearns and urges outward and upward. Where to? To a new light, toward a new sun? But who wouldn't like to express precisely what all of the masters of the new medium of language did not know how to express clearly? It is certain that the same storm and stress tormented them, that they searched in the same fashion. These last great searchers, the first artists with a world literary education, most of them were even writers, poets, mediators, and synthesizers of artistic media. Most of them were even writers, poets, mediators, and synthesizers of artistic media and the sensorium. Literature dominated all of them, all the way into their ears and their eyes. Wagner belongs as a musician among painters, as a painter among musicians, as an artist in general among actors. All of them were fanatics of expression at all costs. I would highlight Delacroix as Wagner's closest relative. All of them were great discoverers in the realm of the sublime, also in the realm of the ugly and that of the ghastly. They were even greater discoverers in the realm of effects with an E, in the realm of showmanship, in the art of show business, all of which were talents that were far outside of their genius. Virtuosi, through and through, with an uncanny access to everything that seduces, entices, compels, overthrows, congenital enemies of logic and of straight lines, lusting after the foreign, the exotic, the monstrous, the crooked, the self-contradictory. As human beings, there were Tantaluses of the will, parvenu plebeians, who knew how to strike an elegant tempo in life and in creation, yet who were incapable of a lento. One thinks, for instance, of Balzac, untrammeled laborers, almost destroying themselves through labor, antinomians and rebels against ethics, ambitious and insatiable without a sense of balance, and without taking any pleasure from being so. All of them at last broken by the Christian cross, all of them sinking down, and rightly so, for who among them would have been profound and original enough for an anti-Christian philosophy? Each of them was a kind of impudently bold, splendidly violent, high-flying and high-soaring higher human being who first taught their century, and it is a century of the mob, the concept of the higher human being. May the German friends of Richard Wagner research whether there is something absolutely German in the Wagnerian art, or whether its directness comes from supra-German sources and impulses. The degree to which Paris was indispensable to the formation of the Wagnerian type may not be underestimated. The depths of Wagner's instincts summoned him to Paris at the decisive moment, nor should one underestimate the degree to which his entire appearance, his self-apostolate, was based on the model of French socialism. Perhaps a closer comparison will reveal, to the credit of Richard Wagner's German nature, that he did everything stronger, bolder, and harder than the French of the 19th century could ever do. Thanks to the circumstance that we Germans stand closer to barbarism than the French, perhaps the oddest thing that Richard Wagner ever created will be inaccessible, unsympathetic, and inimitable to the late Latin races today and evermore. The figure of Siegfried, that quite free human being who might actually be too far free, far too severe, far too cheerful, far too healthy, and far too anti-Catholic for the tastes of traditional and delicate cultural populations. He might have even been a sin against Romanticism, this anti-romantic Siegfried. Now Wagner had richly abolished this sin in his sad old age, anticipating a taste that in the meantime has become political. He took his own religious vehemence down the path toward Rome. Perhaps he did not travel down this path himself, but he did begin to sermonize the path toward Rome, so that no one misunderstands these aforesaid words. I will avail myself of a few powerful rhymes, which will later reveal to less sophisticated ears my intentions, what I have against late Wagner and his Parsifal music. So here is a poem composed by Nietzsche. I hope you like my translation of the poem. In my opinion, some of the best translated parts of this translation, the best rendered parts of this translation, are the poems, in my opinion. Is that still German? Did this sleazy screeching come from a German heart? And is this self-flaying of a German body? This self-flaying of a German body? German is this priestly hand-folding? This incense-fragrant sense-stimulating? And German is this stumbling, tripping, falling? This insecure wham, bam, bamming? Is that still German? Think. You are still standing by the gate, for what you hear is Rome. Rome's wordless faith. End of section 8. We are almost done. We have 2 more videos to go. 2 more videos to go. So tomorrow, I hope, I will be reading for your benefit section 9 of Beyond Good and Evil, which is the final section of this book, and it deals with one of the many nodes of this text. As you have noticed, and as I've discussed, this is a text of multiple variegated nodes. And one of the nodes is the concept of das Vornehme, the forename, V-O-R-N-E-H-M, forename, which I translate variously depending on the context as distinguished, distinctive, sometimes noble, but rarely noble, because we have edel. Edel means noble more closely to that. Elegant, sophisticated. There are a few other approximations that I landed upon, but I think when I recite the translation tomorrow, when I come across the word that I translate as forename, I will tell you, this is forename, because it's an extremely important word for understanding this text. And then the day after tomorrow, although I don't know when you're going to be watching this, perhaps you'll be watching this 200 years from now. Yeah, right. I mean, I could dream. I could practice wishful thinking. But the day after tomorrow, which will be the 18th of May for us who are watching this in real time, I will be reciting the concluding poem of Beyond Good and Evil. And again, I'm very proud of my translation of that poem. I dispense with the rhyme structure. I dispense with assonance. But to be in all modesty, I think it's the clearest rendering of that poem into English. In all modesty. So once more, I am Joseph Suglia. If you don't know by now, my surname is spelled S-U-G-L-I-A. And this was section 8 of my rendering into English of Jenseits von Gut und Böse by Friedrich Nietzsche, which I have translated as Beyond Good and Evil. Until next time, thank you very, very much. I am signing off and signing out. Goodbye.